There is a moment so fast the mind erases it almost instantly. Someone answers differently than expected. A sound happens somewhere in the background. Your phone lights up for half a second. And before the experience is fully felt, something inside you already decided what it means, before you even realize a reaction started. Most people never notice this, because the translation arrives with the experience itself. The interpretation feels inseparable from the experience itself. There is a tiny interval between what happens and the version of it your mind delivers back to you. Most people move through entire days without noticing it exists. A notification vibrates in your pocket and tension appears before the message is even opened. Someone pauses too long before replying and the body begins constructing futures. Sometimes the conversation already continues inside your head for hours after it ended. A room becomes uncomfortable before anything dangerous actually occurs. The reaction is already happening before observation fully arrives. After enough years, that starts feeling like personality. Neuroscience now suggests the brain predicts reality before fully processing it. Neuroscience. You may have never experienced reality directly. Only the version of it your mind delivered first. The ancient Gnostics believed the human tragedy did not begin with suffering. It began when direct experience became inaccessible. In 1945, near Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a collection of buried Gnostic texts was discovered inside a sealed jar. Among them was the Apocryphon of John, a text describing a creator figure unlike the god of traditional religion. Not evil in the theatrical sense. Something worse. A force that imitates reality so convincingly that human beings stop noticing the difference between truth and interpretation. One passage describes the prison of humanity not as chains, punishment, or physical domination, but imitation. A copied world. A reality arriving already explained. Maybe nothing ever needed to hide reality completely. Just interrupt contact with it early enough. It stops sounding ancient once you notice it happening in ordinary life. There is probably a sound somewhere around you as these words unfold. Maybe distant traffic, air conditioning, a door moving somewhere in the background. Notice what happens the instant the sound appears. The mind names it before contact fully occurs. Not after. Before. By the end of this video, you may start catching reactions before they fully become identity. And the speed of that process hides something deeply unsettling. Most people never experience reality directly enough to know where perception ends and interpretation begins. That may be the fracture the Gnostics were trying to describe. Not a mythological war in the sky. A division happening silently inside attention itself. And once that possibility appears, ordinary life starts looking slightly altered. Not dramatically, just enough to feel unstable. Because if interpretation arrives before perception stabilizes, then what exactly has been living your life this entire time? Interpretation itself is not the problem. The disturbing part is how little reality seems to arrive before the translation takes over. A person looks away for half a second during conversation, and suddenly the body reacts, as if rejection already happened. Reality had not confirmed anything yet. The interpretation arrived first anyway. The mind is not waiting for truth. It is predicting survival. Neuroscience has quietly been moving toward this realization for years. Researchers studying predictive processing began describing perception less as passive observation and more as controlled hallucination constrained by sensory input. Predictive processing. In other words, the brain does not simply receive reality. It anticipates it first, then searches for confirmation. Which means most people are not seeing the world as it is. They are seeing the fastest available interpretation capable of preserving continuity. That instability appears in small places first. You feel it in certain silences. After emotional shock, sometimes waking up before memory fully returns. People usually rush to fill those gaps. People reach for noise almost immediately. Anything that restores the internal voice quickly enough. because uninterrupted perception can feel strangely threatening. Not painful, just unfamiliar. This is where the ancient description of the Demiurge becomes psychologically unsettling. Not because it describes a monster, but because it describes a mechanism. The mythology matters less than the pattern underneath it. And first interpretations have enormous power over nervous systems. A facial expression becomes insult before curiosity has time to emerge. Silence becomes danger before ambiguity is tolerated. Uncertainty becomes identity before observation remains open long enough to see clearly. By the time conscious thought enters, the reaction already feels true. That is why certain reactions feel older than logic. Because they are. Something in you reacts long before language catches up. You start noticing how rarely experience is allowed to remain incomplete. How quickly the mind closes the loop. How aggressively interpretation rushes to protect you from direct contact with uncertainty. Maybe the prison was never physical. Maybe the prison was the automatic conversion of presence into narrative. And if that is true, then most people have never spent more than a few seconds outside the translation. The most effective prison would not look like a prison. It would look like reality itself. Not false enough to trigger resistance, not artificial enough to feel imposed, just familiar enough to prevent deeper contact. That is what makes the Gnostic description of the Demiurge difficult to dismiss entirely. Because the mechanism does not behave like oppression. It behaves like mediation. The Demiurge does not erase the real. It inserts itself between you and the real. Quietly. Almost invisibly. Like language appearing too early. Like memory interfering before observation completes itself. Like the nervous system handing you a conclusion before presence has fully formed. And once this pattern becomes noticeable, daily life starts revealing strange repetitions. You walk into a room and immediately become the version of yourself that room expects. You open social media and emotion begins moving before conscious thought even participates. A headline shapes the body's chemistry before facts are processed. The interpretation arrives first. The body obeys second. Consciousness explains afterward. Especially because modern systems increasingly depend on acceleration. Everything now rewards immediate interpretation. Silence becomes inefficient. Ambiguity becomes intolerable. And the faster interpretation moves, the less opportunity perception has to remain open long enough for direct contact. This is why endless stimulation creates such a peculiar exhaustion. It feels more like mental saturation than fatigue. The nervous system never stops converting. Every image becomes comparison. Every notification becomes anticipation. Every pause becomes psychological filling material. Very little is allowed to exist without immediate translation. And what the Gnostics understood with frightening precision is that a translated world eventually begins replacing the original completely. Repetition is enough. A translated reality repeated long enough becomes indistinguishable from truth. That may explain why people defend certain identities even when those identities are destroying them. Because once interpretation stabilizes into selfhood, questioning it feels biologically threatening. The nervous system interprets uncertainty as danger. Not metaphorically, literally. Studies involving the brain's predictive error systems show that ambiguity increases stress responses because the organism temporarily loses certainty about how reality should behave. Prediction error. The mind rushes to close the gap. Any answer feels safer than open contact, which creates a disturbing possibility. Maybe human beings are not addicted to truth. Maybe they are addicted to cognitive completion. The need to know, the need to label, the need to finalize meaning before uncertainty remains alive long enough to transform perception. And if that is true, then the Demiurge is not simply a mythological figure from ancient cosmology. It is the process that converts living experience into manageable certainty. A translator mistaken for reality itself. Which means the most dangerous thing is not illusion. It is speed. Because when interpretation becomes fast enough, You stop noticing that anything translated you at all. Most interpretations of Sophia reduce her into symbolism too quickly. A goddess, a divine feminine figure, a mystical character inside a forgotten cosmology. But the strange persistence of the Sophia archetype across centuries suggests something deeper than mythology survived inside the idea. Something experiential. Something human beings continue encountering without realizing what they are touching. Because Sophia does not behave like information. She behaves like contact before interpretation stabilizes. In many Gnostic texts, Sophia is associated with direct knowing, not intellectual knowledge, not accumulated belief, something prior to conceptual organization itself. Nag Hammadi Library. That distinction changes everything. Because if the Demiurge represents translated reality, then Sophia represents the part of perception that exists before translation fully takes control. More like presence than certainty. A form of contact the modern mind rarely sustains long enough to recognize. There are moments where this appears accidentally. A sudden silence after hearing devastating news. The instant before tears arrive. The strange suspension inside awe. Certain moments in nature where thought briefly slows and experience stops feeling narrated. People often describe these moments as more real afterward. Not because new information appeared, because interpretation weakened temporarily. And without constant translation, reality feels unnervingly immediate. That immediacy can be beautiful, but it can also feel destabilizing. Because the self depends heavily on continuous narration, identity appears stable only because interpretation never fully stops moving. Sophia interrupts that movement. Not violently, quietly. Like a gap appearing inside automatic meaning. Most people reach for stimulation within seconds. The moment external stimulation disappears, unresolved perception begins surfacing underneath the translation machinery. That is why silence often feels louder than noise. The system underneath becomes audible. Thoughts arrive already shaped. Emotions arrive already labeled. Future scenarios begin constructing themselves automatically. And the unsettling part is how little conscious participation seems involved. A thought appears. Then identity claims ownership afterward. Ancient contemplative traditions noticed this long before neuroscience did. In both early Gnostic practice and later meditative disciplines, observing thought without identification was treated as a form of liberation because it exposed the instability of the narrator itself. Contemplative neuroscience. Not stopping thought. Seeing thought arrive. That difference matters. Because the moment a person notices interpretation forming in real time, the authority of the translation weakens slightly. Not completely. Just enough to create distance. Experience becomes less compressed. The world stops arriving entirely pre-labeled. For a few seconds, experience feels less processed. The sound of air moving in a room, the physical weight of attention itself, the strange unfinished quality of reality before language seals it into categories. Maybe this is why Sophia was described as lost. Not because she disappeared cosmically. Because direct contact became too brief to sustain inside a civilization built on accelerated interpretation. And if that is true, then the fracture is not ancient history. It is happening continuously. Every moment experience becomes smaller than the explanation imposed onto it. Human beings usually believe suffering comes from events. Something happened. Something was lost. Someone left. Something failed. But the deeper damage often begins milliseconds later, when experience becomes identity. Interpretation turns pain into identity. This always happens to me. I am this kind of person. This proves who I am. And once suffering becomes narrative, it stops behaving like experience. It becomes architecture. This may be the real meaning behind the ancient idea of the fall. Not humanity becoming sinful. Perception becoming trapped inside interpretation dense enough to replace direct contact entirely. The Demiurge in this sense, is not merely creating illusion. It is stabilizing identity through repeated translation. A painful memory becomes self-definition. Fear becomes personality. Anticipation becomes lifestyle. Eventually, the nervous system stops distinguishing between survival patterns and identity itself. That is why anxiety often feels prophetic. Not because the future is known, because interpretation continuously rehearses danger before reality arrives. The body responds to prediction as if it were already happening. Cortisol rises, muscles tighten, attention narrows. The translation becomes biological. Research in effective neuroscience has repeatedly shown that the brain reacts to anticipated threats with physiological responses remarkably similar to real ones. Effective neuroscience. The body does not wait for certainty. Interpretation is enough. And suddenly the ancient Gnostic language stops sounding symbolic. Because the false creator is no longer an abstract entity somewhere outside existence. It is the mechanism that continuously converts possibility into fixed psychological reality. A translator producing continuity faster than consciousness can question it. This is why certain thoughts feel inevitable. Not because they are true, because repetition creates perceptual gravity. The same interpretations loop so many times they begin generating the sensation of self-evidence. Most people call this who I am. But identity may simply be interpretation repeated at high enough speed to feel permanent. And modern life intensifies this process constantly. Modern systems continuously reflect identity back at people. Infinite mirrors, reflecting previous versions of yourself back at you. The system rewards stable identities because stable identities are predictable. Predictable people consume consistently, react consistently, remain psychologically legible. The fracture becomes economically useful, and maybe that is why modern people feel exhausted even when physically safe. The nervous system is trapped inside uninterrupted interpretation. Every experience immediately converted into meaning, every emotion instantly categorized, every silence filled before direct contact deepens enough to destabilize the narrative. Nothing remains raw long enough to breathe, which leads to a possibility the ancient texts implied but never stated directly. Maybe the deepest form of control is not forcing human beings to believe lies. Maybe it is preventing them from experiencing reality before interpretation claims ownership of it. Because once the translation arrives first, the self forms around it automatically. And the longer that continues, the harder it becomes to remember there was ever a difference between perception and the voice explaining perception inside the mind. The modern world did not invent the fracture. It industrialized it. For most of human history, perception still encountered resistance. Silence existed naturally. Waiting existed naturally. Attention had empty space to settle before the next stimulus arrived. Now the interval is collapsing. A notification appears before the previous emotion finishes processing. A new opinion arrives before ambiguity fully forms. An image replaces another image before perception deepens enough to become contact. And something strange happens when interpretation becomes continuous. People stop experiencing reality as presence. They experience reality as reaction. Reaction becomes continuous. The cycle becomes so fast the body starts confusing movement with meaning. This is why endless stimulation often creates emotional numbness instead of vitality. The system is overloaded with unfinished interpretations. Every headline demands psychological positioning. Every platform rewards immediate certainty. Every algorithm accelerates emotional conclusions because emotional conclusions increase engagement. The translation process is no longer private. It has become infrastructural. Social media platforms discovered something profoundly profitable about human psychology. Interpretation spreads faster than observation, especially fear, especially outrage, especially identity reinforcement. A calm nervous system pauses before reacting. An unstable nervous system shares immediately. And modern systems increasingly reward the second one. Not because someone secretly designed an evil civilization, because accelerated interpretation is economically efficient. Attention became the resource, reaction became the product, which means the fracture described in ancient Gnostic language now exists at planetary scale, not metaphorically, neurologically. Studies on attentional fragmentation have shown that constant task switching and rapid digital stimulation reduce sustained focus while increasing cognitive fatigue and emotional reactivity. Attention fragmentation. The mind becomes easier to steer when it loses the ability to remain with unfinished perception. And the terrifying part is how normal this now feels. People wake up and immediately enter translated reality. Notifications already waiting. Narratives already formed. Emotions already triggered by events not personally experienced. Before the body fully wakes up, interpretation has already occupied consciousness. The day begins inside someone else's conclusions. This creates a peculiar form of distance from existence itself. A person can spend entire days surrounded by information while never directly contacting experience for more than a few seconds at a time. Everything arrives mediated, filtered, predicted, pre-labeled. Even solitude is now filled with interpretation streams. Music, podcasts, feeds, messages, constant internal occupation. Silence starts feeling threatening because silence interrupts the momentum of translation. And without translation moving continuously, something uncomfortable begins surfacing underneath. Raw perception, unfinished emotion, awareness without immediate categorization. Most people rush away from that state instantly, not because it is dangerous, because it feels unfamiliar enough to destabilize identity temporarily. That may be why modern people fear stillness more than exhaustion. Exhaustion keeps people moving. Silence makes things harder to ignore. And once this becomes visible, the ancient Gnostic warning stops sounding mystical altogether. The danger was never simply deception. The danger was acceleration. A speed of interpretation so constant that human beings lose the ability to remain present long enough to notice they are living inside translations of reality rather than reality itself. There is a moment most people never examine carefully enough. The instant a thought appears. Not the content of the thought. Its arrival. Because thoughts rarely feel like arrivals at all. They feel authored, personal, self-generated, as if consciousness deliberately created them from somewhere inside a stable center called me. But if attention becomes quiet for even a few seconds, something unsettling starts revealing itself. Thoughts appear first. Ownership comes second. A sentence forms in the mind. Then identity claims it. An emotion rises. Then the self says, "This is how I feel." The sequence is so fast it creates the illusion of unity. But the illusion begins cracking the moment observation slows enough to witness thought entering awareness before identification fully attaches itself to it. That crack matters, because entire civilizations have been built around reinforcing identification with mental translation. Not observation of thought, participation in thought. And once participation becomes constant, consciousness loses the ability to distinguish between direct perception and narrative activity. This may explain why people defend thoughts that are visibly harming them. Not because the thoughts are rational, because the thoughts became integrated into selfhood. To question them feels like psychological dissolution. Ancient contemplative traditions repeatedly circled around this same realization. Liberation begins when thought is seen rather than automatically inhabited. Philosophy of mind. Not destroyed, seen. Because if the Demiurge represents automatic translation, then the problem is not interpretation itself. Human beings cannot function without interpretation. The real question is whether interpretation remains transparent or becomes mistaken for reality itself. A thought appears saying, "You are failing," and instantly the body reorganizes around the statement. Posture changes slightly, emotion adjusts, attention narrows. memory searches for supporting evidence. The translation becomes experiential reality within seconds. Not because the thought was true, because consciousness fused with it automatically, and modern systems exploit this fusion constantly. Advertising installs interpretations. Political systems compete to occupy perception first. The nervous system stabilizes emotionally around initial meaning before deeper analysis even begins. This is why corrections rarely change people. The body attached itself to the translation long before logic arrived. And suddenly one of the strangest Gnostic ideas starts sounding disturbingly practical. The false world is not maintained through force alone. It is maintained through identification. A translated thought enters awareness. The self claims ownership. Reality reorganizes around the claim. Again and again. Until the person no longer knows where direct experience ends and inherited interpretation begins. Maybe the strangest part of all this is realizing the mind rarely experiences reality in silence. Something is almost always translating first. And after enough years, the translation starts feeling more familiar than direct contact itself. If the Demiurge is not a being but a process, then the fracture is not happening somewhere far away in myth. It happens every time experience becomes identity before awareness fully arrives. Later today, notice what happens when the next thought appears. Did it actually come from you, or did it arrive already interpreted? And if this video put language around something you felt but never fully named, leave a comment. I want to know where you noticed the fracture most clearly. Subscribe if these investigations belong in your life. Share this with someone who has started feeling that reality itself has become strangely pre-translated. Sophia may have never disappeared. People just stopped staying still long enough to notice what remains underneath the narration.